So hello everyone, thanks for joining us. We're gonna talk about machine learning at NIST and data science and where it can go from Gilad Kusne. He received his academic degrees in Carnegie Mellon University. He is currently a staff scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. And he is also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. So his research is part of the White House Materials Genome Initiative that he might tell us about at NIST, a project which aims to accelerate the discovery of advanced materials. And he also won several awards. One of them was the NIST highest award, the NIST Bronze Award. So, and he is leading several educating programs and for data science, machine learning. So, Gilad, please teach us.
Okay, thank you, Yevgeny. So let's see. Let me. Okay, so I see some stuff going on in the chat. Okay, cool. Yeah, so let me share screen. So please, okay, is this working? Yes. Okay, so please feel free to interrupt me with questions. I'm going to just sort of give a high-level discussion of the stuff that we're doing at NIST and the path, how we ended up doing all this stuff. So, please feel free to interrupt me. It will help me know if I'm talking about the right stuff that's of interest or, just rambling. Yeah, so, okay. Before I get started, I'd like to mention that we have a boot camp that runs every week. Sorry, not every week, every year. Once a year, we have an in-person and now it's virtual boot camp that runs every year. That's 1 week long. And I think this last year we had, I think 300 or 400 people attend. So every year it grows, and we basically cover from fundamentals of how to write stuff in Python on the first day, all the way through the most advanced machine learning techniques. And with a focus primarily on, so everything's hands-on with open source code. And we show you how to, the fundamental concepts of building autonomous systems. So, it builds from fundamentals all the way up to, active learning and decision-making, machine learning for decision-making and closed loop experimental systems. Yeah, so if you have any interest, feel free to contact me about this. And let's see. So, okay, so I tend to start off by talking about what is autonomous, because at least in NIST, we found, so when I started doing this about 10 years ago, I ran into a problem of the definition of autonomous. People seem to keep mixing it up with automated. So automated is a term focused more on doing things for repetitive tasks, where you can just build sort of a decision tree of if, then, else, etc. So you can figure out what to do based on a list of rules. While autonomous is more focused on decision making, where the system learns and learns how to better make decisions as it's going. So it has independence of decision making. And for an autonomous vehicle, you want the system to be able to navigate the world, manage walking pedestrians, navigating cars in traffic and all that kind of stuff. But you want it to stick to things that it knows. You want it to stay on the road. You don't want it to start exploring and driving through a mall, because it's never done that before. While with autonomous physical science, that's exactly what we want. We want it to pursue anomalous and weird behaviors. We want it to find new and interesting things. So, in both these cases, we have machine learning deciding what to do next, except in this case, we wanted to sort of stick to well-defined regions, while here we want more, autonomous physical science, we want more exploratory type stuff. And so here's a list of our sort of high-level goals at NIST. So, we're interested in building platforms. We're interested in building robust platforms, and both physical and simulation platforms that allow us to do a whole bunch of cool science. So we have them in solid state, soft state, and biological materials. So, all three areas we have autonomous systems that we're developing or are working to finalize. All the enabling technologies, which some of you are very much interested in, all the things like how best to capture your data, how best to organize it, how best to share it, following the FAIR principles, so that, as we're going forward, things are still usable. We're primarily focused on Bayesian scientific AI. So much of machine learning and AI has been developed for doing stuff like analyzing pictures of cats and dogs. While in the scientific field, we don't have tens of thousands of images of cats and dogs, of our experimental data. We might just have one piece of data, but we do have tons of theory. And so the question is, can we incorporate that theory to make use of even one piece of data, to make really good predictions even based off of one piece of data? So can we encode our prior scientific knowledge into our machine learning? And specifically, we're interested in probabilistic models. So how can we make better decisions on that, using our prior knowledge with uncertainty? So, doing so every time we make a prediction, we associate that prediction with uncertainty, and then we can use that uncertainty to help guide us make future decisions. And then that falls under optimal experiment design. So that's that active learning part. How do you decide what experiment to do next? And then, educating customers, the Bootcamp. Also, we have a course that we run at the University of Maryland. And I also run the Bootcamp. I've also turned it into a mini boot camp that we also run for like a day or half a day at different workshops, for TMS, MRS, APS. We run these boot camps, to sort of cover the basic concepts of machine learning and their applications to physics and material science. And we're also interested in reference data sets and benchmarks, so that there are lots of groups interested in developing machine learning techniques. How do you decide which one's better to run them against each other? Okay, so I guess I'll start with talking about the path towards autonomous. I'm guessing, so if anybody has any questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt me. I just gave like a 3.5-hour lecture for students, and it's much easier to give a talk when there's some back and forth. So please feel free to interrupt me or send a chat so that I know there's any questions. So how we started down this path towards autonomous is, I guess, over a decade ago. I came to NIST from CMU, and I thought it would be cool if there was it didn't seem like there was much focus on machine learning for material science or physics. And so I thought that might be a cool area to focus on. I managed to get a postdoc in the field and then build up from there. And about 2014 or so, we started thinking about autonomous systems and building machine learning and control of our experiments. And so I'll show some examples from back then. So the motivating challenge that we were interested in is, one of my closest colleagues is Professor Ichiro Takeuchi, who's an expert at high-throughput material synthesis. So what he's capable of doing is he's able to generate hundreds or thousands of different materials that explore some composition space or some other synthesis parameter space. So for instance, in this case, if you're interested in learning about how materials properties change as a function of composition, you can co-sputter these three materials, nickel, aluminum, manganese, onto this wafer, so that each point on the wafer is a different material. It's a material made up of a different composition of these different mixture of nickel, aluminum, and manganese. And so then each of these little squares corresponds to one of these points here in this composition diagram. So we've got samples that are more nickel than manganese or aluminum. We have samples that are more manganese than the others. And then we have points in the center which correspond to an even mixture. And so this way we can rapidly, within a few hours, generate hundreds or thousands of samples that explore some synthesis space and start investigating their properties. So we can look at their structure, their magnetic properties, optical properties, mechanical properties, all that kind of stuff. And the other great thing is that because we have this sort of exhaustive data set, we can use these data sets to benchmark different types of machine learning techniques for decision making. So one of the first challenges that I became interested in was being able to rapidly generate a phase diagram. In this case, we have an example of a phase diagram where we're looking at iron, cobalt, nickel. The phase diagram basically says how much, based on the synthesis parameters, what structure should you expect, what lattice structure should you expect in the material. So we have these regions, these phase regions, which indicate that all of these samples of varying composition should give similar structure. And then we have these boundaries that indicate some structural change. So that on the other side of the boundary, we have materials of a different mixture of structures. And the classic way of doing this is that you make one point, one material at a time, you measure its structure, measure its properties, populate the graph with one point, and then make the next material, etc. But with this high throughput method, we're able to make these materials all at the same time in parallel within a couple hours. So we're able to characterize all of these samples very rapidly. We're able to generate all these samples very rapidly. And then there's a whole field of high throughput characterization that's been developed, which once the materials are generated in parallel, there are these systems from the high throughput community. They're able to rapidly measure point by point each sample on the wafer, collect that data, and then you have the opportunity for doing machine learning to do data analysis. So at first, the real bottleneck was data analysis, because you could make the materials within a couple hours, you can measure them within maybe, but also a short amount of time. And then the next challenge was, how do you turn all this knowledge that you've captured into something useful, into actionable knowledge? So data analysis was the first obstacle. And so at NIST, we were interested in solving these problems using the scientific AI type approach, where we try to encode as much prior knowledge as we can. So in this case, you encode Gibbs phase rule and concepts of, there's lots of other rules associated with phase diagrams. For instance, that if materials of similar composition should have similar properties. There are lots of these rules. And so the thought is to encode all of these prior physical rules into the machine learning, so that when it makes a prediction, the prediction is physically realizable. It's not just doing a search for whatever math solution makes sense. It's specifically looking for stuff that you could actually observe in the lab. And so then you can also get faster predictions with less data, because now you have physics to guide your analysis, and you need less expertise, because now the expertise is built into machine learning. And so these are some of the physical rules. So in the beginning, what we were doing was synthesizing materials, measuring their properties, putting them into a machine learning package, doing the analysis, handing that the experimentalist would then look at the results and then make a decision on the next set of materials to synthesize. And, this was the closed loop. And we were able to do this very, very rapidly, to the point that we were able to get the machine learning was providing results within seconds, like 10 seconds for each measurement. And since each measurement took on the order of half a minute, so we were able to get the live analysis. As the data was coming in, we were able to get live analysis. So this was back in 2014. And so then we were able to, actually along that path, we were able to make some nice discoveries, some new materials. And we were thinking, one of the first things we were thinking of is we have physics built in, let's try to incorporate also other external knowledge. And there's tons of external, yeah.
But before you go on, what's the measurement that you were doing there? The spectrum. You're showing hysteresis, but then you've got like intensity plot of an X-ray spectrum there.
Right, yeah, so in this case, the idea was to try to, there was an interest in, we were looking at rare earth free permanent magnets. And so these were, so these were opto and magnetic hysteresis loops. And we were interested in trying to identify materials close to a specific phase boundary. The thought was that if we got close to a certain phase boundary, that we might see some more anomalous behavior, some more interesting behavior. And so the machine learning in this case was mapping out the phase diagram as the data was, so we have the combinatorial library loaded at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. X-ray diffraction measurements are being done, and we're able to collect the phase diagram. And so the idea was that as the data is coming in, we can then focus more of our time towards areas close to the phase boundaries where we might see interesting material structures. And then afterwards, there was also this analysis of the magnetic properties of the materials, and there's a clear correlation between structure and magnetic properties, and there was a discovery of a new material right along this phase boundary.
So you're doing it as a function of position on a wafer, right?
Yes. So in this case, it's actually as a function of composition, because
the different compositions are, so I'm not—
the pre-measured. So we before we brought the library to the combinatorial library to SLAC, the library was measured for composition using WDS, I think.
But I see, okay, so I'm going to make sure I understand. So you've got, in the picture, I see a wafer and it says moly, iron, cobalt.
Right.
And it's made somehow by making composition gradients that are
right.
Moly, yeah. So the sputtering, so the moly rich are going to be on the left because that was the sputter. The moly sputter target was over there, and so on and so forth, right? And then you're going to get some phase, some resulting phase, which is either a solid solution or something, right?
Right.
And then what you did is you did X-ray measurements where you addressed each point.
Right.
And then you found out what the phase was at each point. And then finally, you do some kind of hysteresis measurement to get the ferromagnetic behavior. But that's also addressed to points on the grid. Or what you did is when you found good candidates, you sputtered a uniform film with that composition and then did the hysteresis on that. Is that what happened?
Yes, and then building bulk samples.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So in this case, this wasn't a closed loop. The only closed loop part of this was in the part that the data was coming, the X-ray diffraction patterns were coming in, and a phase diagram was being computed at every iteration.
Yeah.
Afterwards, the magnetic measurements were done, and then exactly. So then once they identified that there's this some interesting hysteretic response near a phase boundary, they started they did TEM. They looked at the fine detail of those materials. They made bulk versions of that and discovered a new it turned out that this was a new rare earth-free permanent magnet.
Yeah, okay, now that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And were you using adaptive learning to do the sampling, or it was brute force? There was no closed loop thing here at all?
Yeah, at the time, this is 2014. This was just it was at the time it was just measuring point by point based on there was an index associated with the samples. So the goal was just to generate the phase diagram as quickly as possible. And each measurement takes about 30 seconds. So the full wafer took maybe, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 hours. So the idea was that as the data is being collected, you're able to, hone it. The experimentalist is then able to, on the fly, be able to say, well, I'm more interested in this sample, or somewhere around this sample, the region around this sample. Let's measure more points here than elsewhere. So that was the motivation, a while ago. Yeah. So this is before we shifted fully to. So right after this, in about 2014, we decided that since we have the ability to do on the fly, why don't we put adaptive control in charge of this? And so then in 2015, that's exactly what we did. So then we were able to do exactly what you're saying. We started to say, rather than measuring any point on the wafer and then collecting the data, let's try to get data points that are specifically informative of the phase diagram, so that instead of taking 5 hours to measure one wafer, we could, maybe get enough information from half an hour of measurements. And so then so that's skipping to this part. So this is in 2000, so about 2015, we ran autonomous control over X-ray diffraction for collecting phase diagrams. We were able to get, so in this case, the machine learning is building based on prior knowledge they collect. So we have the built-in physics and external data from databases. It builds a prior prediction as to what the phase diagram is, which is given by this color coding. So the color is the probabilistic phase diagram. So it thinks that the most likely there are phase boundaries here and here for this diagram, for this composition spread, this ternary. These are the correct phase boundaries. And if we measure some data points, it then decides which next sample on the wafer to measure to best improve its knowledge of the phase diagram. And so then it would then measure that point and then do this cyclical back and forth. And unfortunately, we decided back in 2014, 2015 that it wasn't of interest enough to be able to have autonomous control over a measurement system, to be able to get into nature or science, that instead what we needed was a materials discovery. So we decided to hold off on this until we actually made a discovery. And unfortunately, in that time, everybody else jumped into the space, and then it became a very active space. And so then right around the same time that we got this working, Benji got his system working for process optimization. So while we were trying to do material optimization, materials discovery, he was doing process optimization and got this really nice paper on a carbon nanotube optimization. So then, so we sort of, we should have just published and we didn't. And, I regret that, but, so, yeah,
Yeah, that's a good lesson. My postdocs and students are listening. Everyone pay attention. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that the work that was using the Kriging algorithm to do the sampling?
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. You should have published it.
Well, actually, no. In this case, we weren't doing Kriging. We were doing Gaussian random. I was doing Gaussian random fields, which is a Gaussian processes is a nice setup, but there's Gaussian random fields has a lot of benefits that so there's sort of two spaces of the same thing, different representations based on how you define the kernel function. If you define the kernel function or the inverse of the kernel function, then you get different types of benefits from it. So so at the time we were doing Gaussian random fields. So The challenge was that back then we were thinking about this in terms of like the physics challenge. In physics, once you start doing an experiment, it takes a long time for other people to catch up because they have to make similar materials, they have to have similar control over the equipment. But in machine learning, that's not the case, right? Machine learning is very aggressive and very fast, so it makes sense to publish quickly. In the meantime, we were though focused on building machine learning techniques that have a lot of physics. So we were focused on the scientific AI part. So we were publishing on the scientific AI part of it. So, how best to incorporate not just physical knowledge out, physics theory, but also external data. How do you use external data to improve your, information from the inorganic crystal structure database, or the recent paper. So, we had some papers on this, on how to do phase mapping with physics-informed AI. And then more recently, in this recent work, we looked at, there's DFT calculations. They're computing phase diagrams beforehand. So can we employ that? So along those exact lines, so we noticed that since machine learning had removed the bottleneck from data analysis, the new bottleneck was characterization. That we synthesize materials in a few hours. We're able to make 1,000 samples, 1,000 materials in a few hours. We're able to analyze all the data within a few seconds or a few minutes. So then the main challenge was measuring the data. So on a typical Bruker, it can take a few weeks to a month to measure all the structure data for one wafer. And at the synchrotron, it would take 5 hours, 10 hours, something like that. And it's hard to get time on the synchrotron system. So that was, there's a desire to reduce the amount of data you collect so that you get more knowledge at the synchrotron. Yeah, and so that was the motivation to expand machine learning just from analysis to control and characterization. And we had all these motivations. So if you go back to like 2015, where I was presenting this stuff in like 2015, but yeah, we never published. So anyways, so the argument was minimize the number of measurements to get maximum knowledge, reduce the amount of worker hours and instrument time, start it up and let it run. You also reduce human bias in the whole process, and instead replace it with traceable algorithmic bias. So then the analysis of the data is done by machine learning, and you can figure out why did it make that decision by looking through the code. In our case, we're more focused on interpretable methods. And then also in decision making on which experiment to do next, that part is also algorithmic. And then we're making this argument that this could potentially democratize science, that there's this benefit of, by reducing the amount of expertise needed to do an experiment and encoding that in the machine learning, you could potentially make it easier to do science. And I already showed this. So, this slide is basically the machine learning deciding which experiment to do next to identify a phase diagram. And finally, we made a discovery of a new material, so we decided to publish. And so that was a year ago. We got that out. So that was on this method called closed loop autonomous materials exploration and optimization. And so this combines two concepts. One is active learning, so sort of two different concepts of active learning. One is sort of gaining exploratory knowledge of the material space. And the other one is Bayesian optimization, where you're trying to get some specific knowledge of a material optimal. And combining these two, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so the exploratory factor is gaining knowledge of the phase diagram, because a material structure is indicative of its functional properties. So if you're exploring some large composition space or some large synthesis parameter space, if you can first figure out where the phase boundaries are, you can then sort of segment the search space into regions where they have different behavior. And So the thought was to do that. So we, initially the machine learning, so here we have an example where we're looking again at iron, gallium, palladium, and we're pretending like, so this is a simulation, the actual demonstration I'll show in a minute, but we're looking for materials that have maximum saturation magnetization, which are indicated by the color coding. So here, the best materials are over here in the yellow region. So we want to find materials with, maximum saturation magnetization. But the first thing that the Cameo does in this case is it starts looking for the phase boundaries. It then, once it starts, it looks for the phase boundaries. And then once it has, sorry, my computer's freezing. Once it converges on the phase diagram, it starts doing materials optimization. So it's under the assumption that, so for instance, the materials up here are less likely to have a maximal saturation magnetization, while materials in this phase region are more likely to have it. So then you're restricting your search space. And so then you can very rapidly hone in on the optimal
Gilad, how does it know that? That's prior knowledge that you give it, is it?
So it does a convergence. So it's doing phase mapping until convergence. So it's specifically trying to do, so it's using a risk minimization. So it's choosing
how it's finding the phase diagram, but you said it prefers this phase to that phase.
Right. So because as it's collecting the data, so for each data point is collecting two pieces of information. It's collecting the structure and the functional property.
I see.
Yeah. And so then
so it's getting the saturation magnetization at each point.
Yes, exactly. And so then it now has enough information for this one to, to say that this region sucks. It has low, right? And it can identify the boundary of that region so that it can now cut that off and just ignore that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I got it.
And, so this was part of this closed loop autonomous materials exploration optimization, where we have machine learning decide what experiment to do. Then we have the machine learning deciding the experiments to execute, measure, controlling which data to collect or simulate. We can ask an expert, and then doing this Bayesian scientific AI. So probabilistic modeling with built-in science to decide which experiment to do next. And then based on the predictions from this part, from the analyze section, it uses that to make the decision on the next experiment to perform. And we focused primarily on probabilistic methods that are interpretable, and we built some nice visualizations. And we found that this method of using the phase diagram to guide the optimization, it provided an acceleration over off-the-shelf methods. So if you use just like common methods of active learning, like upper confidence bounds, one of the ones that I think this is being obstructed, but yeah, here, upper confidence bounds. So we were able to show that, oops, that's the wrong one, that this type of method provides significant improvement over off-the-shelf methods. And during the process, we were able to discover a new material, a new nanocomposite phase change memory material, which is now, apparently it's the best in its class. And we got this significant acceleration.
So Gilad, I would like to maybe ask you to give a few words about the Bayesian method. Can you maybe explain it in simple words and what is this algorithm is all about?
Yes. Okay. So my computer is stalling, but here, come on. All right. So when we're doing phase mapping, so in this part, what it's doing is it's something like a Gaussian processor kriging. It's a field called it's a method called Gaussian random fields. So basically what it's trying to do is it's assuming that each point can belong to multiple phase regions. And it's trying to figure out basically it's doing segmentation of the composition space. So it's using Gaussian random fields to do segmentation of the composition space. And is also able to learn in a lot of unsupervised learning techniques, you have to decide, like k-means, you have to decide there's going to be 5 clusters or 8 clusters or something like that. In this case, it's able to learn the number of clusters, iteratively. And it's using risk minimization. So it's choosing each next sample based on an estimate as to whether which sample will provide a maximal reduction in the misclassification probability for all the points. So if you were to look at every point in that composition space and say, if I were to measure this one composition, and it had a diffraction pattern that indicated it was from region 1. How much information would that if I then propagate that information throughout the phase diagram, how would that improve the phase diagram? Now, what if that point had a diffraction pattern that indicated it had phase 2? How does that propagate out? Now phase 3. And now, so you iterate for each point, all of its possible measurement results. And then you do that for every point, and you see how each measurement could potentially impact all of the other predictions. And based on that, you get an estimate of potential misclassification error. And so then you can find the point that has the biggest impact on all the other points. Basically, that's it. So the point that best stabilizes the rest of the other points, the phase region determination for the other points. So those are the main 2 things there. So we have, there's also all this automatic data pre-processing that we have, but ignoring that. So it's basically this Gaussian random fields with risk minimization. And then once you have the phase boundaries, so what it does is it just segments those regions, and then does upper confidence bounds in each of those, in the region of interest. But it also encodes another assumption, which is that an optimal material is either close to a phase boundary or close to the center of the phase boundary. And you can, based on the material property that you're interested in, you can switch that. So, so initially we're defining the phase diagram. Then we find where the phase boundaries are. We converge. So there's a convergence criteria. You say, when do we stop seeing changes in the phase diagram? Then we stop and we switch to materials optimization. And then you can do something like upper confidence bounds, but weight the samples that are closer to the phase boundary give them greater weight. And so then that helps you narrow in on the material much more quickly than off-the-shelf methods. Yeah, so that's the basics of Cameo. Does it make sense to talk a little bit about upper confidence bounds and those things, or because I'm sort of dropping these jargon. I'm not sure how much of that is useful to discuss.
I think we can move on, and if someone have this question,
Okay.
he will ask.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, all right. So more recently, we started, applying these techniques. So the goal is just to keep pushing more and more into the Bayesian scientific AI. So more recently, we did this with neutron scattering for magnetic material, where the idea was to try to figure out magnetic structure and the parameters of magnetic structure of the materials we're interested in. And in this case, so we load a magnetic sample into a neutron scattering system, and at NIST we have control over 2 things. So let's say we're primarily interested in figuring out the Néel temperature. So that's where in this diagram over here we have this. So this is the magnetic function. So this is the magnetic property of the material as you're increasing temperature. So here's temperature. And here's the magnetic, some value of the magnetic property. So this is the magnetic peak observed by neutron scattering, the intensity of the magnetic peak. And as you increase temperature, the magnetic peak starts to decrease. So there's a change in the magnetic structure of the material as you increase temperature. And at some point, you hit the Néel temperature where that peak disappears. And now you just have, just normal structure. And so one goal is to figure out, can we find that anneal temperature more rapidly? And so in this case, we were controlling two things. We were controlling the position of the detector. So we're able to figure out, so we know that we have peaks that are associated with physical structure, with lattice structure, and we have peaks associated with magnetic structure. And so the goal of the machine learning in that case is to figure out the minimum number of measurements to get maximal knowledge of the magnetic structure peak. Then when we have that information, it's using that information to then guide. So let's say we figure out that this peak has an intensity of 1,000, that information with probability, so we're doing this all probabilistically, is encoded here. And we have underlying physical laws. In this case, we initially used the Weiss equation to guide, to define the curvature of the magnetic. So we basically have a physical law on the left over here. We know that there's a discontinuity. Oh, my mouse is frozen, my computer is freezing. So on the left over here, we have a physical law associated with the magnetic structure. Then we have a discontinuity associated with the anneal temperature. And then we have a bias on the right. So what we're trying to learn is those three things. We want to know where the discontinuity is. We want to know what the parameters are of the physical law on the left. And we want to know the bias on the right. And so we use active learning to guide this. And this is using fully probabilistic model. We're doing all this stuff. And we were able to run this at NIST and Oak Ridge National Lab and show that we're able to get a significant acceleration of a reduction both in the number of measurements required and the amount of time required to do the measurement. Yeah, so if there's any questions about that, feel free. So we're also doing something similar with electron microscopy, which I'd like to skip for now because Austin's going to talk about it at MRS. So we're interested in, as some of you guys are interested in, autonomous control over different types of user facilities and measurement systems. So photon-based, electron-based, and neutron-based. We're interested in encoding as much prior knowledge as we can, making it probabilistic, and using that to guide the next set of experiments, and showing as much acceleration as we can. Okay, so it's 2:45, and I'm just getting to the full autonomous. So I'll just say a few words about this. So our motivation for building fully autonomous, so that's for autonomous characterization, where we're not making new materials. So the motivation for having a fully autonomous system is that if we're looking for a new material, we're looking at material property as a function of some synthesis parameter, let's say temperature. We could do, let's say, 100 experiments. We can make 100 different materials varying the temperature. So that's 100 experiments. Now we're interested in exploring pressure. So that's another 100 possible parameters. Another parameter with 100 different values. So now we have 10,000 possible experiments. And as we increase, we get something on the order of 10 to the n or 10 to the 2n experiments, where n is the number of parameters that we're interested in exploring. So can we use active learning to help us decide out of all of these preposterously large number of experiments, which experiments to perform next? And so we have, we're either building or built full autonomous systems that we're hoping to publish on soon. So there's a corrosion resistant coating system, which is led by Howie Jores and Brian DeCoste at NIST. We have, this paper should come out soon. So this is for autonomous control over atomic layer growth of materials. We have autonomous for polymer optimization. So this is mixtures of polymers. We have a big project which is funded for autonomous exploration of new genetic sequences implanted into microbes. And then we have other applications. For the corrosion-resistant system, this is a scanning droplet cell. And this work is again led by Brian DeCoste and Howie Jerez with Jason Patrick Simpers, who recently left NIST. And it's able to synthesize a new thin film material using electrochemistry and then characterize it for its corrosion resistance. And come on. Yeah, and there's also this demonstration of being able to do multi-objective optimization for the materials. Let's see. Next slide. Yeah, and for the genetic sequencing thing, it's again, it's trying to figure out what's the next best genetic sequence, which could have functional properties of interest, and then implant them into a microbe and check the performance of the microbe. And we're also interested in just general scientific AI. So how can we more encode the knowledge of the physical experimentation into the machine learning? So for instance, in this case, we have a lot of situations where we don't have full control over the parameters. So we might say that we're going to synthesize a new material with a voltage of 5, but in fact, there's some uncertainty in that. So the equipment actually sets the voltage to 4.93. How can we exploit that knowledge, the knowledge that there's there's a stochastic nature to our synthesis system to improve our, to improve prediction of which experiment to perform next. Okay, and we're also trying to put all of this stuff and everybody else's stuff into a database. So this is something that might be of interest. So this is the resource for materials informatics. And the goal is to basically, this is still preliminary, and we have a lot of people who are interested in supporting this project. So the goal is basically, we scour the internet for interesting Jupyter notebooks and other types of scripts that demonstrate machine learning for material science and physics and chemistry and whatever else. And we then curate that. We create a curated database where we indicate what kind of system is this associated with, what materials are being looked at, what kind of characterization equipment is being used, what kind of simulation tools are being used, and so basically create a searchable database of this stuff. So if you go to this website, you'll be able to see this, this website. So if you guys are interested in contributing, that's also a really great opportunity for NIST. Just because we built up this sort of, it's a very simple system, but the goal is to populate it and make it easier for people to find what already exists for doing all this stuff. And yeah, and last thing is, if any of you guys, any of you students are interested in a postdoc at NIST, along any of these lines, we have a bunch of opportunities. In this case, unfortunately, the biggest opportunity is this National Research Council funding, which is tied for US citizens. So then we would apply for funding, and then you can come to NIST for 2 years to work on one of these projects, or alternatively contact me if you're not a US citizen, and there might be some other opportunities. And I think, yeah, that's it. So I can stop sharing, or I don't know if it might still be useful to, yeah. So that was a lot of random content. Hopefully it was understandable.
So Gilad, the NRC positions are not open to green card holders, or they are? Has to be.
They're not. Yeah, they have to be citizens, unfortunately. But as with all the other research faculty, we're trying to get funding from many other places. So we do have some additional funding yeah. So there are other opportunities.
So thank you, Gilad. It was for me very, very interesting. And thanks for everyone who came here. And that's all, I think.
Yeah. All right, awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good
You
day.
too.
Bye bye.